Hi, my name is Clemens Ebner, and I'm from NVIDIA's Robotics Lab in Seattle. Today I'm presenting joint work with Arsalan Musavian and Dieter Fox about a new dataset called ACRONYM. To get your most pressing question right out of the way, no, ACRONYM is not an acronym. ACRONYM is a dataset that contains roughly 18 million simulated grasps with a parallel jaw gripper. But before diving into the details, I would like to stress the importance of datasets in everyday research. Datasets are at the heart of the deep learning era, yet it seems they are oftentimes undervalued and not incentivized according to their impact. A funny take on this phenomenon is shown here by Josh Tobin. And I think the same is actually true for the robotics community, and ICRA in particular. So let me fix that. I took a quick look at how many dataset papers were published at ICRA in the past. Among the 10,000 papers in total, there were actually 23 dataset papers. That's the depressing news. The good news? Out of those 23 papers, 17 were presented at last year's ICRA, so hopefully this trend will continue, because the impact of datasets is undeniable. ACRONYM, for example, the dataset presented in this paper, has already influenced a number of approaches and applications, ranging from grasp planning of unknown objects to human-robot handover and object rearrangement. The first three works shown are actually presented here at ICRA. I recommend you check them out. But back to ACRONYM. What exactly does ACRONYM consist of? To answer that question, I would like to run you through the data generation process of ACRONYM. First, let's start with the objects. We selected 8,872 objects from a dataset called ShapeNet-SEM. ShapeNet-SEM is a subset of ShapeNet, but with a particular twist that is interesting in the sense that it includes semantic properties about those objects, such as materials, weights, or natural upright positions. This can be helpful in the case you want to use ACRONYM and the grasps in there for other downstream tasks. To make all those objects graspable, we scaled them down randomly such that at least one dimension is smaller than the gripper aperture of the Franka Plunda gripper, which is 8 centimeters. For each of those models, we created candidate grasps. This grasp sampling was generated by using an antipodal sampling scheme. We have shown in the past that this sampling scheme strikes a nice balance between discovering diverse grasps and at the same time high quality grasps. It's the same scheme that was also used in DexNet, for example. Each of those candidate grasps satisfy the following two criteria. The gripper geometry should not be in collision with the object, and at the same time the bounding volume between the fingers should be in collision with the object, which means basically that we're not grasping thin air. In total, we are sampling 2,000 of these grasps per object. And you can see that it is quite dense, as shown here on the right, even though here we only show a subset of all those 2,000 candidates. Each of those candidate grasps is then run through a simulation. In particular, we're using the rigid body simulation Flex, which is accelerated on a GPU. Shown here is a parallel evaluation of multiple grasps. So what is happening is we close the grippers and then we perform a shaking motion. This shaking motion will induce perturbations into the grasp configuration, and only those grasps that are stable enough and survive this test will be labeled as successful grasps. So in total, we have in this entire dataset 17.7 million grasps, and more than half of them, 10.5 million, are successful ones. Apart from the raw data that we provide, we also provide a little tool, a Python script, to generate more cluttered scenes. This is done by essentially sampling support surfaces on some of these ShapeNet-SEM objects, and then placing the objects from the ACRONYM data set on top of those, and removing the grasps for which the gripper is in collision. This way, one can generate even more data for these cluttered scenarios. When comparing ACRONYM to related datasets, one should take two things into account. First of all, I think there are multiple great datasets out there, and depending on the particular task and application you're thinking of, multiple of these datasets are helpful. In some cases, maybe even a combination of some of them. But the nice balance and distinguishing factor of ACRONYM is the following. First of all, it's a 3D dataset, which means it's different to, for example, in the top row, these 2D or planar top-down view examples. Second of all, it is evaluated in a physics simulation, in contrast to others which mainly use analytical measures. And also in terms of amount or quantity, it is quite large. One should note that it's not the largest one. For example, GraspNet here has much more grasps, but given these grasps, it has much more object variety and geometric diversity, as can be seen here. And at the same time, in terms of density of the scene, I think it also strikes a nice balance. It is much denser than other competitors such as DexNet or EGAD. In the second part of this paper, we would like to show the actual value of ACRONYM with existing GRASP architectures. So what we did is we chose the GRASP architecture presented here, 60 of GRASPNet, and retrained it without any changes on ACRONYM and looked at the performance. So basically we are comparing to this dataset in this row, which is a dataset that is has less grasp. It's not much smaller, but it has less grasp. But more importantly, it has much less diversity in terms of objects and object classes. At the same time, it's much denser, more grasps per object. Also important to note that it is not a strict subset of ACRONYM. There are classes actually in here that are not in ACRONYM, such as boxes. So what do the results look like? We compared 3 different GRASP architectures, 2 variations of 60 of GRASPNet, and GPD, which stands for Grasp Pose Detection, another common baseline for grasp planning algorithms. And for each of these architectures or algorithms, we trained a version on ACRONYM and one version on what we will call here dataset number 1. Dataset 1 is the one that was used in the original 60OF GRASPNet publication that I've shown on the previous slide. The results are shown here in this plot on the right. This is essentially a precision recall plot. It shows on the y-axis what we call the success rate, which is in our case the number of successful grasps divided by the number of all proposed grasps by the algorithm. And on the y-axis, it's called here coverage, which is based on a ground truth set of grasps for each object. And it's basically a ratio of how many of those ground truth grasps were recalled by any particular algorithm. So the optimal algorithm would try to have a curve, that is as far to the upper right hand corner as possible. And the main takeaway of this plot is that all the solid lines for each of those algorithms, for the red, green, and blue curves, the solid version is above the dashed version, which means that the model that was trained on ACRONYM performs better than the models trained on dataset number 1 in all of these cases. The test set that was here used in this plot was a held out test set from ACRONYM. We did the same thing with a held out test set from dataset number 1, and the results are essentially the same. Also in these cases, we see that the solid lines are above the dashed line, which means that the models that were trained on ACRONYM also perform better on these held out objects of dataset number 1. These are the quantitative results. We also have qualitative results, and we can see those differences between those trained models. Here we are showing the best performing model, 60OF GRASPNet, and the top row shows the results trained on ACRONYM, the bottom row on the same objects, same observations for a trained version on dataset number 1. What you see in each of these objects is in light blue is the mesh of these objects, and the dark blue dots are the actual observations, the point clouds that the algorithm gets to see, and on which it will kind of propose grasps on this basis. What we can see in these plots is that the ACRONYM trained model is creates much more diverse grasps and denser grasps. For example, shown in this plate example here on the right, all these little green forks go around the rim of the plate, while in the in the original version of the paper, the grasp set is much sparser, and the same effect can be seen on the head here, on the chair, glass, and also very pronounced in these scissors. So with these ACRONYM trained versions, you will get a wider variety of grasps and also more successful grasps. In summary, we presented a novel dataset called ACRONYM, which contains 17.7 million grasps labeled in a physics simulator. And we showed in experiments the usefulness of that dataset with existing architectures, which at the same time can provide baselines for future research. If you are interested in using ACRONYM, please don't hesitate to go to github.com/nvlabs/acronym. If you find any problems or struggle with anything, please open a GitHub issue and I will try to be as responsive as possible. Thank you for your attention.